Exodus was hot. It wasn't just hot from the heat, obviously, of being out in the desert, but it was hot because of the disappointment that the nation of Israel was experiencing at this time. Because not too long ago, they were on the precipice of the realization of this incredible promise that God had made to them, that they would inhabit a land that was beyond their wildest dreams, that God would utilize to allow them to bring forth the eventual Savior of this world. But they blew it. They blew it. They decided not to trust in God. They decided to step back from the promised land, and because of that, their curse basically was to wander in the desert until that generation of adults had passed away, and then the children would then inhabit that land. And so now they had to pick up everything and continually move on to another destination, led again by the pillar of fire or the cloud the smoke billow of clouds. But either way, it was a frustrating time for them. They knew what the camp setup was like. They had to put the tabernacle in the middle. Surrounding that tabernacle was the Levites, who were the priests who were responsible for connecting people with God. And then outside of that were the 12 tribes of Israel, where most of the people inhabited. And it was frustrating. It was frustrating. They were condemned now to be nomads for decades. They couldn't put down their roots. They couldn't build up with neighbors. They couldn't experience a community. They couldn't build. They couldn't have a town. They couldn't have a city. They couldn't have what they were promised. Now they had to pick up and move, pick up and move, pick up and move. And it was overwhelmingly disappointing. But some people within the camp took it a little bit further than just that. They took it a little bit further than just the disappointment. It began to kind of bring some toxicity inside of their hearts. One man in particular, his name was Korah. Korah was a Levite. He was one who was stationed right outside the tabernacle. But he wasn't a priest like Aaron because he didn't come down Aaron's line. So he was just responsible for kind of taking care of the tabernacle, not for actually doing priestly duties. He also saw Moses there, who wasn't a priest either. He was more the political leader. But he saw these two guys, and he saw what was happening, and in his mind he thought, I could do better than this. These guys are idiots. Look at what has transpired over these 2 years. We are condemned to be out in this wilderness for 40 years. So the grumbling began. And Korah, who was stationed right to the south of the tabernacle, reached out to those who were also grumbling just a little further south in the camp of Reuben. Now, Reuben was Jacob's eldest son. And the entitlement that came with that should have been that because he was the eldest, there would be some rights that would go along with being part of the eldest son's tribe. But it wasn't so. It was still Moses and Aaron. And these guys were a little kind of put off by what was going on. And so Korah heard that there was this man called Dathan and Abiram, who were also a little disgruntled about the way leadership was happening in Israel. And so they decided to approach Moses and Aaron. But it wasn't just those three. They had got on their side 250 influential men in the camp who had had enough. I mean, enough was enough. This lifestyle was ridiculous. And so they confront Moses. And Korah says to Moses, "Why have you taken this upon yourself? Why are you in the lead? Are we not all holy? Are we not all chosen by God? And yet you are the ones who have put yourself up as the ones who are chosen by God to lead us. And look at what's happened to all of us. So we here are realizing that this justice isn't working and we want a shot to lead. Moses was not happy with this. He fell on his face and he realized that this wasn't just a grumbling. This was what was turning into a mutiny. The people were trying to take over what God had set up. And so he converses with God and he comes back and he says, listen, here's how this is going to be. This is how it's going to play out. All of us, all you 250 are going to take this censer, which was a part of the tabernacle practice. And we're going to take a censer tomorrow and you're going to bring it filled with flame and filled with oil. And then God will reveal who is the rightful leader of this nation. Dathan and Abiram are like, forget it. We've had enough of your shenanigans. So we're not even going to show up. And so the next day, 250 with their censers show up, waiting for God to reveal who exactly is going to be the lead of the nation of Israel. I mean, who wouldn't want this job anyway? And God shows up too, and God has had it. And God says to Moses and Aaron, step away from them. I'm going to take them all out. I'm going to take them all out. And Moses, in his caring form, begs God to relent from that, and God relents. And God says, but what I want you to do is I want you to go to the tents of Korah, of Dathan, and Abiram, and tell people to get out of their tents because the earth is going to take them out. And so Moses comes before the tents of the two guys who didn't show up. And he says to all the people, get away from the tent. And he says, listen, here it is. If these guys die by natural causes, you will know that I am a fraud. But if the earth swallows up these tents, you will know who the rightful lead is. All of a sudden, the ground starts trembling a little bit. The earth cracks open and swallows up the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. All of their belongings, all of who they are, all of their record of their existence in this nation of Israel is down into the pit. The earth closes up, and it's like they never existed. But God wasn't done yet. The rest of the 250 who were holding the censers, fire then comes down from the sky and takes them out as well. And all that is left is the ashes and the censers, which were made of bronze, that these 250 were holding. God goes to the priest Eleazar and he says, listen, go and collect all of the 250 censers of these men that they were holding. I want you to melt them down. I want you to hammer them out and put them over the ark as a reminder, basically, of who's in charge. Who's in charge. This story is not a fun story. It's a rough story. It's a story of many things, of Korah's pride, of the people's rebellion, of the influences of God himself. And sometimes we have a hard time making sense of it. But I want to ask you a question here. If you were in one of the camps that weren't a part of the 250, or maybe you were part of the 250, just watching what was going on, how would you react to this particular situation? Again, the background. Let's say you're a 42-year-old. Let's say you're a 42-year-old in the nation of Israel. When you were born into slavery. That's all you knew for 40 years. All you knew was the crack of the whip, the oppression of the Egyptians. And then when you're 40 years old, all of a sudden you realize that there's some grumbling and there's some rumbling that, hey, we're going to be rescued. We're going to be freed. You hear this guy, Moses, and you start to see what's happening around. You start to see the 10 plagues that are affecting everybody else, but it's not affecting your community. And all of a sudden, there's this edict that goes out that says, hey, you need to take some blood of the spotless lamb and you need to put it on your doorpost because there's going to be a death angel, and after this, we're going to be free. So you do that, and all of a sudden, the next day, you find yourself in this mass exodus from the nation of Israel, or from the nation of Egypt, because now you are freed from slavery. You are now going into the desert, but you realize you hear something and you turn around and there is all of Pharaoh's army chasing after you. And they look like they've got blood in their eyes, ready to kill you for what you've done. But yet you come to this Red Sea, and all of a sudden Moses stands up there, he puts his rod over and the thing splits in two, and you walk across on dry land. You look back and it takes out Pharaoh's army. You're in the desert, you start to wonder, what are we going to eat? What are we going to eat? And all of a sudden, there's this stuff that just shows up every morning that you eat. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but hey, we're not slaves anymore. You get a little thirsty and you wonder, how are we going to quench our thirst? So all of a sudden, there's this water just starts gushing from this rock. You've never seen that before. You run into some perilous times with other nations that are angry and they're fighting and they want to fight you, and all of a sudden you're winning. And then you come to the promised land, but you turn away from it. And now you're in this situation where you see these 250 plus men rise up against Moses. And God doesn't put up with it. And he takes him out. What would your response be? What would you do in that moment? Well, probably in your mind, if you're like me, you think, well, I'd get my act together. I'd probably shape up and think, yeah, we know who's in charge yet. But look what the people did in verse number 41 here. But on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron. The very next day. What? I mean, you have just, not in recent memory, seen this happen, like yesterday, but you've gone through 2 years of seeing God at work. You've seen what happens. You've seen ultimately that God is the one who is in control. And yet, it doesn't matter. The day after all of this happens, well, Moses and Aaron, what did you do now? That's the reaction. To me, this is one of the most baffling verses in the Bible. That people look at this and people can witness what is going on around them. And yet they look at it with a sense of, it's no big deal. We're just going to go back and we're going to revert back to what was going on. So my question here for the nation of Israel at this point is, what is it going to take for you to take God seriously? What's it going to take? What's it going to take for you to realize that God is the one and everything else is subservient to God? What's it going to take? Well, looking at this passage, sometimes we think to ourselves, if I was there, I'd shape up because I've seen what God can do back in the Old Testament. I've seen how God is so powerful and how God can, wipe out people like he did. He opens the earth and he swallows them up and all this stuff. But we miss kind of really what the real issue is. It's not really about what took place. It's really about man's heart through all of this. Because with this, we look at the Old Testament, and you've probably heard this as well. People look at the Old Testament and they think to themselves, well, I don't really like the God of the Old Testament because the God of the Old Testament seems angry. But that perspective on anger is a little off. A better way of looking at the perspective of the Old Testament is that the God of the Old Testament, his holiness is very, very evident. It's not that God is just angry and he's looking for excuses to open the earth up. But when you look at the Old Testament, you have the holiness of God that is on display. And the holiness of God is a little different than it is now. It's almost as if the holiness of God is what people are trying to get to in the Old Testament. And there is, on the surface level, this back and forth struggle between God's holiness and justice and God's grace. Because when people talk about the Old Testament, usually what we hear are the things that God has done negatively. But what we refuse to listen to are a lot of the times what God has done for the graciousness of his people. The fact that he did free them. The fact that he did sustain them. The fact that he did supply for them. And we come to the Old Testament, and here is God's holiness full on display. And the way that it operated, obviously, was a little bit different than today, because in order for people to gain that holiness, the law was put in place for them to attain that, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. So they required the sacrifices of goats, of rams, of all of these things through the priest so that they could be connected to God. And when they weren't connected to God, God's holiness took over so that they chose to be separated from God. It was a very much boots to the ground. This is the way it operates. And we look at it as though it's just something as though do good, you're all right, do bad, you're not all right. It's a little bit more complex than that. Because none of us were doing good. It was all about how do we connect to God and his holiness. And so for these people, when we look at this, we think, well, if I saw what was happening, I would definitely shape up because I wouldn't want that to happen. Now, when Jesus came on the scene, things kind of changed. Things changed on how we relate to God. No longer do we have the law. No longer do we flow through priests. But don't mistake this. God's holiness has not changed. The holiness of God is still in place. God is not a different God in the New Testament than God was in the Old Testament. The problem comes into play when we look at the Old Testament and we think that God has somehow, he's cooled off a little bit, he's aged a little bit, he's like that. He's turned from the angry father into the sweet old grandpa. But that's not the case. The holiness of God is still intact. But yet, instead of the justice of God being on full display like it was in the Old Testament, the justice of God was put full on Jesus himself. So that for us to get to God is not through a law, it's not through a priest, it is only through Christ who fulfilled the law and is the ultimate sacrifice. So today, as you live, you are living under this grace. Now, before you get too excited, and before you get too happy about this, there's a problem with it. Because the problem exists in who we are as human beings. I believe we're the same type of people that lived back then. We have the same hearts. And because we're under grace, we become lulled into this belief system that the holiness of God isn't quite as important as it was back in the Old Testament. Because as we live under grace, it's easy for us, especially if we have weak hearts, to step back from that idea that God's holiness is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly real. And what we do is we're lulled into this idea that things just don't matter. And the reason we think they don't matter is because we're not living under this rule of law where it is so right in our face. You do good, it seems to go well. You do bad, the earth opens up. We don't live under that. In fact, in some ways, you do bad, good things happen. You do good, sometimes bad things happen. And we have this mentality of the Old Testament, and we bring it over into our lives to think that our lives are as transactional as they were in the Old Testament. That if I will just do good, then good things will happen. And then if I do bad, then bad things will happen. Even the disciples were thinking along this line. When Jesus came to the man who needed healing, and they asked him, hey, Jesus, did somebody sin in this man's family that caused this? But we don't live under that. What we live under more or less are the natural consequences that exist when we don't follow Jesus's way of living. But because we're under grace and God's wrath has been held up by Christ himself, we're lulled into this kind of idea that things don't really matter. Things don't really matter. I mean, if the people back here in Numbers 16 could witness what they witnessed and the next day still not take God seriously, what is it to say that we who live under grace, who think we are getting away with stuff that we just kind of let slide, what's to say that we don't take God as seriously as we should? And so my question to myself, not just to you, my question is, what is it gonna take? What is it gonna take for me to take God's holiness seriously? To realize that God is not just up there ignoring everything. You see in my speaking a lot, there's a lot of grace-filled stuff. There's a lot of things that are kind of on the mindset of the love of God and the grace of God that he gives, that we're hurting, we're in pain. We need to understand God's love for us and that how he can rescue us and lift us up. But don't mistake that. Don't mistake that for the other side of this, which is the holiness of God, which cannot be put in a place where we just ignore it. Last week, when we talked about them coming to the edge of the promised land, it's full of grace, it's full of opportunity, it's full of addressing things that will make us feel good. The forgiveness of God, the presence of God. But sometimes we're lulled into thinking that God is just up there and he's just looking at us in a place where everything's just do what you want. Do what you want, come over and you know, I'll just hug you and everything will be good. But we forget that the holiness of God is still in play. So what does it take? What does it take for us to take God seriously? I want to just key in on two simple things that I've had to ask myself, and I think we can ask ourselves about where we fall as far as the seriousness of God. The first one is a question about our prioritization of him. This is from Jesus himself, moving out of the Old Testament into the New Testament, under grace. This is what Jesus said is expected of us. This is the greatest commandment. Jesus gave it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Jesus said, this is the greatest commandment. This isn't something that's just put in there to make us feel good. This isn't something that we just get to have a nice Sunday sermon on and then we go outside and forget it all. But the dangers of living under grace is that we take verses like this as a suggestion for our Christianity. And Jesus said, no, it's not a suggestion. This is the greatest commandment. So in my life, I have to ask myself, how seriously do I take this? What level of seriousness is this in my life? Do I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my mind? Or have I lulled myself into this belief system that doesn't really matter? Now, I would never tell you it doesn't matter, would I? You would never tell me this doesn't matter. I mean, we're church people, right? You've heard this. Nobody in their right mind would say, hey, have a good day, but you know that whole greatest commandment? I don't know about that one. Nobody would say that. Nobody in their right mind. But the words, do they match about 10 inches south into the heart? You see, the question here is when I look at my heart, I look at my values, I look at my priorities, how seriously do I take the holiness of God in those areas? I mean, how seriously? We can fool each other. I mean, we could do it. And I'm not saying anybody's fooling anyone. I'm just saying I can fool you. That's all I'm saying. Because we know what to say, especially in a church situation. But how is your heart? Is it totally surrendered over to the holiness of God through Jesus Christ? Is it at a level where you have given it all over? How are your values? The values in your life when it comes to your everyday decisions. Because honestly, that's really where it's seen, in your everyday decisions. In the way we conduct ourselves on a day in, day out basis. The values of his kingdom. You've heard it said a lot on Wednesday night where Jesus' main approach has been to follow me, to rise up to the level of adopting his kingdom values into our lives. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, isn't that just trying to earn something? No, this isn't about earning. This is about the outflow of realizing the sacrifice that has been made for you. You're not loving God to attain something. You're loving God because of what's already been attained. And so I look at my values and I'm thinking, do I value him or do I value what I have in myself? Because the trust issue is not just something that's random. Everyday values, the trust of what I really value in life comes into play. And for many of us, the struggle is, what do we trust in? Who do we value? And many of us, we've been taught in our world to trust things that have no real value outside of this life that we live. We're putting all our eggs in this basket of a few decades. We're valuing things that the Bible is very clear one day will deteriorate. They will turn into dust. We're putting trust into ourselves that in one visit to the doctor could be gone. We're putting trust into numbers on a computer screen that, as we saw this week, can be adjusted rather quickly. And I have to ask myself, when do I take God seriously? When do I value him And when do I prioritize him above all else? When we talk about prioritizing God and putting him first, a lot of times we just revert to show up to church. Show up to church. But it's beyond just showing up to church. The prioritization of your world, nobody knows it except your heart. Nobody knows it except your heart. And I can be so judgmental on the nation of Israel. I can be so judgmental on them who saw it firsthand, and yet I'm doing the same thing. The next day I wake up and I value so much other stuff than I do him. And the question I have to ask myself is, when do I take him seriously? The heart, the value, the priority. But Jesus gave another thing behind prioritizing him. He continued in that same passage. He said the greatest commandment is to love God, but the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. To love your neighbor as yourself. To love others. Again, I can dismiss this. I can find reasons not to do this. But translated, what that means is that I don't take it seriously. I don't take the holiness of God that is seen here seriously. Now, when we talk about loving others, sometimes we get to the point where we're talking about loving people outside in our community. You can go even beyond that, and which is rightly so, but we only have a couple minutes, so I just want to take it a little bit more to here. Loving others. If there's one place where this should be more evident than any place else, it is in the community of Christ in the church. And yet, if there's one place where I've seen it become more toxic than out there, it's in the community of Christ in the church. And what this says to me is that, yeah, Jesus said it, but because, we're kind of living under grace, and because, I don't see anything really happening, we just kind of push this one away. Now, if something were to happen and there was this big blow up, it would be obvious that there were issues in the church. But what I see more often is the slow burn, the slow deterioration of relationships inside of the church. Jesus was very clear about this too in Matthew 18, where he talked about the importance of making sure that our relationships are taken care of as far as it is on our side. But unfortunately, many times this is just kind of off to the side, and we allow ourselves to enter into gossip, backbiting, rumors, and probably what I feel is one of the most dangerous of all is to remove ourselves from the community of that particular person inside the community of the church. And it's a slow burn. It's a slow burn. Love others. That is God's holiness for us. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not saying I'm addressing any particular issue or anything like that. But if you're sitting here and you think that there's a issue, this is serious stuff. Because what we're playing with is not just random suggestions. It's God's holiness. God's holiness that just did what we saw happen in Numbers chapter 16. Now, I'm not saying if we don't deal with this that God's going to open up the earth and swallow this whole church. That's not what the way it works. But we can't just dismiss the importance of this stuff. And friends, what is so hard I find in my own life, and I see in so many people's lives, is just the fact that we think because we're getting away with it, that it's no big deal, but it is a big deal. Amen. The holiness of God is an incredibly important and big deal. And the question again is, what's it going to take for us to take it seriously? These were the 2 commandments that Jesus said. 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God and love others. What's your heart telling you? What is your heart saying? You know what your heart says. Don't let it deceive you into thinking that, there's an excuse for everything. Because let's be honest, there is an excuse for everything. I can give you many excuses why I don't have to prioritize God. And you'll be like, oh yeah, that's good. It's good. But what does the heart say? So you might be thinking, well, what if there is a problem? Because, it does seem like under grace that things just kind of get away with a lot. Let me kind of end this message on kind of a downer, to be honest with you. But if you think I'm just like a downer, listen to my other stuff, hopefully it's a little more positive. But I think we just do a disservice if we don't kind of connect to the entirety of who God is. And yes, God is grace, but God is also justice. And when we talk about this, what are the dangers of this? What if we don't take God seriously? Because there are so many people who don't take God seriously. I've been in a position where I haven't taken God seriously. Well, it can mean a couple things. One, it can mean that you're out of touch with God. It could just mean that you've just kind of drifted and you've allowed the idea of grace to overtake your thinking and to lull you into a place that isn't quite accurate. In fact, Paul was asked this question when he was asked, does this mean we should keep on sinning so grace can be like seen all over the place? He's like, no. So maybe check that. Could be that we believe in God, but we haven't really surrendered to God. Believing in God is one thing. Believing in that there is a God is one thing. It's another thing to come under the authority of his holiness. This is what Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and the 250, and the story goes on, and it's a lot worse after this, if you want to read it. Thousands of people refused to do. They believed, but they didn't put themselves under his authority. And the third thing, maybe most important of all, is that maybe if you don't take it seriously, maybe you don't know God. I'm not judging. I'm not even saying this is a reality, but I do feel that it's appropriate to question ourselves into wondering if we don't take him seriously, if we're not prioritizing him in our lives, if we're not in the community of believers reconciling, communicating, being together under the name of Christ, then maybe we haven't come to the realization that the only way to really understand this is through accepting what Christ did. It's a tough story. It's a tough story. I mean, even from the standpoint of just reading it, it's tough. It's tough sometimes to understand God. It's tough sometimes to wonder, well, this isn't the way I would handle it, but the truth is that there's more to it. There's more complexities to it. For us today, living under grace, the question just comes back. How seriously do we take his holiness? How seriously do we take his holiness? If you have questions, if you're in a place where this is not making sense, or if you're in a place where you see maybe prioritizing God and loving God is kind of on the downward track than the upward track, the worst thing you can do is just ignore it. It's the worst thing to do. Because the grace of God is so much more powerful than anything that has to do with the justice of God, because the grace of God overpowers the justice and allows us to come before God because the justice was taken care of on the cross. And all of this, all of what I'm spewing out to you today is not meant to be negative. It's meant to invite you into the abundant grace that God offers to you. The question is, will you receive it? Why don't you stand with me and let me pray for us today. Father, thank you for the opportunity we have this morning. And as always, I ask that what's been said here has been something that has challenged us to look deeply into our own relationship with you. To not just play church or to play Christianity, but to realize the importance of a relationship with a holy God. Thank you for the men and women, and may we all together live in a grace-filled community that experiences, enjoys, and loves the incredible love that you have for us and the grace that you have given to us. In your son's name, amen. All right, everybody, have a great week. We'll see you Wednesday night.